Here is the list that we saw in a prior chapter for criteria for assessing an economic system. And what he's going to do is use the list, the potential strengths, and then how it could be a potential weakness. And he's going to do that through the lens of the market-centered system. This is all very interesting stuff to read, this part of the chapter. For brevity, I'm just going to focus on the prosperity and the reduced prosperity just to get a little idea of what he was saying in that part. And then I'm going to jump down to sustainability, human development, and democracy, because those are probably some of the areas where capitalism gets criticized the most. The basic argument for how capitalism goes or creates prosperity is the story of efficiency. We've introduced the idea of efficiency in a prior chapter, and as it says here, it's a more static type of efficiency. And that's the idea that markets will end up being economically efficient because firms are going to have the incentive to minimize costs and the incentive to produce those goods people most want. So markets left on their own, no interference, are going to achieve this economic efficiency. And then we're introducing at this point this idea of dynamic efficiency, where there's going to be market pressures for the economy to increase output over time, to become more productive with the resources it has, as well as come up with new technology, maybe new products, certainly new production techniques. And there's this incentive to do this because, again, you're seeking this competitive advantage over the others that you're competing against. So overall, the capitalist system is very flexible in response to change. Going back to one of the initial things brought up in this book, prices serve as signals which allow producers and buyers to respond to the signal in a way that will lead to the optimal allocation of our resources and growing output per person, and prosperity, and life is awesome. In this section, I want to acknowledge some of the criticisms of the market system, how it might not lead to prosperity. And the basic point of all of these criticisms, I believe, really, is that previous discussion was essentially assuming something called perfect competition. And as the assumptions embedded in perfect competition are violated, then the conclusion of all that beautiful efficiency can be reduced. Like you may not quite achieve it. So some of the things that are raised in the book is the idea of economies of scale. There really is not economies of scale in perfect competition. It's going to be a whole bunch of small firms. Nobody dominates the market. But a lot of products have this idea of economies of scale built in, that there's a certain size your firm needs to grow to because the costs are actually falling as you get bigger. And then there's only room for so many firms, and so you end up not with these small little firms, but you might end up with several large firms, and then that can affect the efficiency story we just told. One way it can affect it is it can create the desire for collusion instead of competition. That might choose to be a more profitable outcome for the firms. And again, you're now not on that beautiful efficiency story. Another thing is, in the prior story, we were assuming that all resources were mobile and easy to get. If I release it from this industry, it'll just move over to this industry. And the truth is, labor specifically, of all the factors, is not terribly mobile because labor is people. So that will affect our conclusions. Another thing about perfect competition, we didn't even mention it in the prior beautiful story, but perfect competition, all the products are identical. There is no differentiation between them. And as soon as some products, within one industry are different, like different brands of coffee, for example, that can create brand loyalty, that creates market power, and now you're not in the perfect efficient world we were just talking about. Another thing in perfect competition we assume is that everybody has perfect information, the buyers and the sellers. But of course, that is not true. We don't necessarily know everything about the products we're buying. It just creates some of these issues, which are interesting to go in depth with, which I will spare you on. But the point is that because of these information problems, we don't get to the ultimate outcome we were describing. And also, one of the things I say sometimes, you may have noticed, is when the market is functioning, you get these wonderful outcomes. Well, some of the times that you won't see the market functioning as I'm describing with the invisible hand is if you have an issue of externalities, where in the process of producing the good, I just accidentally also produce something bad like air pollution or water pollution. But from the point of the view of the producer, I can just ignore that. That's not affecting my costs. It's just making life bad for everybody else. And so that's not going to be the most optimal outcome if this particular production activity creates an externality. So for those types of activities, that is a problem and a challenge to our prosperity. And then there are some goods that really aren't private goods. They really are with these things we call public goods, and that creates the collective action problems. That creates the possibility for people to free ride, and again, impacts our story of the invisible hand and ultimate efficiency. So basically, to sum all of this up to this point is just the idea that our story about how markets create prosperity is implicitly assuming perfect competition, which is not really the real world. And so we just have to be aware that to the extent that those prior things are violating the assumption of perfect competition, then economic efficiency is reduced. All right, so to the extent we're not just all a whole bunch of small little businesses, to the extent that resources are not mobile, to the extent that products aren't identical but in fact are differentiated, and the more products that have some sort of externality or other issue, to the extent that this is all occurring, that is reducing the achievement of all that beautiful efficiency. All right, and then the last thing he does is pretty technical, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but in case you read it and you just didn't know what was going on, I just want to address it really quickly. And so this is going back to the prosperity slide, where he's saying that the market will lead to economic efficiency and dynamic efficiency. And he's actually saying that even in the context of perfect competition, there's a bit of a conflict between the two. And he mentions three different things. So one is economic efficiency, everybody minimizing their cost. Basically what this is, if you can remember back to micro and you had to do the 4 market structures and one of them is perfect competition. The story is within perfect competition, the long run position is $0 economic profit. And if that were the case across the economy, there's not really capital being pooled in hands that would be available and incentivizing innovation. And without innovation, you're not likely to get the dynamic efficiency. The second thing he says is that economic efficiency is, again, assuming perfect information, it's assuming perfect resource mobility. But if you think about what dynamic efficiency is really saying, is that somebody's able to find these opportunities that have not been exploited. And what we're basically saying is that's the role of the entrepreneur. They have some sort of information that they're aware there is a product or a need that isn't being served, and he or she is going to go out there and create this business that will take care of that. And so dynamic efficiency needs limited information. It needs a barrier to entry, which kind of conflicts with economic efficiency. And then the third technical thing he mentions is that economic efficiency is based on the idea of a whole bunch of small firms, whereas to truly achieve dynamic efficiency, you're back to that story of needing firms to grow to a certain size, a certain scale. And so these two things are in conflict. All right, so don't worry yourself too much about those last 3 things. That's just being complete in this story. I want to jump ahead in his list of criteria in the interest of your time and talk about sustainability. So sustainability is a big topic these days in the business world, as it should be. So if we think about it in the context of what he's saying here, one way to think about it is minimizing costs, that markets are looking to minimize costs. So they are inherently looking to minimize the use and waste of resources. So that's good for sustainability. The price signal we've been talking about is essentially could be looked at as scarcity pricing. So if we're talking about a resource we're running out of, like oil, if that were the case at some point, one of the things that would happen is the price of oil will rise. And as it's rising, it's a signal to not use it for things that aren't as necessary. So you start using it for just the most needed uses. And so that's you're going to try to substitute away from oil as much as you can, which you need to do if in fact the reason the price is up is we are running out of it. It's also going to signal that maybe we need to find substitutes for it. And as the price of it rises, some of the substitutes, which maybe are not economically worth it now, become general or real options at that point. So anyway, it's just another way of understanding how the price system in the market system can encourage us to actually use our resources in a sustainable manner. And also the prosperity that is coming from the market-centered system, the prosperity that it has created means that there is wealth that can then be used to invest in research that might take us to another product. If we're worried about using up some of our resources, the actual prosperity from the market system is providing us the funds we need to spend time to find replacements for products, for resources that are less sustainable. So how can a market system be a threat to sustainability? He mentions a few things. One we've talked about in a prior part of the book, which is externalities. To the extent that the production process is producing air pollution, water pollution, or other sorts of problems, without some check on that, that's obviously not a sustainable thing for our environment. So the market alone won't fix it. We have to do something to fix it. There's often a criticism that markets are very short-sighted, that they're looking, of course, at profit maximization, but maybe they're not taking in account the long run in that process. There is a built-in process or expectation of growth in capitalism. That's another reason why some argue it's not sustainable, that at some point you can't continue to grow. Although I think they're forgetting that what it's also trying to do is find a way to be more productive with their inputs. So for the same amount of inputs, you're trying to get more outputs, but that's a different argument. And then there's the potential for institutional crowding out. Essentially, the idea is that capitalism, and I guess market behavior in general, is based on self-interest, and you don't want to take that so far that you start damaging the realm of the community, for example, or the feeling that we're all in this together, right? That could be problematic for sustaining the overall system if you have that sort of institutional crowding out. When it comes to human development, we don't necessarily think about the market system first thing. But if we think about it, people in market-centered economies are embedded in a cultural system that expects law-abiding behavior. You need to be considerate and respectful because you're going to be interacting and trading with people that you don't really know. And you want to have a good reputation. So yeah, it actually does incentivize this sort of good behavior. Because you will be rewarded economically, there's an incentive to develop your own human capital. And similarly, there's an incentive to increase the responsibilities that you have at work, maybe take on extra risk if you're going to open a new business. And overall disincentivizes unproductive activity because, you could be getting paid right now, right? So this is different ways that we may not think of on our own, but how markets actually do encourage human development. How market systems restrict human development might be a list that we're a little more familiar with. Now, you may not be familiar with this term, but there's this idea of adaptive preferences, that your preferences for what you want, what you think you want, are actually shaped by the system you are in. And a market system is all about market transactions. So we learn essentially materialism, and maybe even immediate gratification becomes what you need. I think the way to think about this is in contrast to how maybe a community-centered system would be functioning. Another potential problem of a market system is it, prior we were saying that you would have an economic incentive to develop yourself, but what if instead you're just stuck with some boring job where you're just doing the same thing over and over again? That's not going to do much for human development. And then, even though we did talk about how there's a desire to protect your reputation, if we're looking at it on the negative side, the market-centered system has self-interested behavior. It's kind of a big part of it. And again, if that self-interested behavior kind of moves out into the other two realms, you might have some negative behaviors occurring. Finally, how does a market system impact democracy? The good news is that markets are decentralized. So they create a dispersed center of power, and that can maybe be a challenge to any overly concentrated state power. It was only with the rise of markets and then, of course, later capitalism that the private sector was able to gain the power to check the power of the state and demand rights for the citizens. Another positive would be how freedom to choose, which is part of the market, also makes us expect to have freedom to choose during the or within the political process. And the respect for property rights, which is so important to the capitalistic system, leads to the idea that there's other civil rights we should have, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, etc. So the things required for a successful market system do bleed in positively to the ideas of democracy. But to conclude how the market and democracy might interact, we do have to acknowledge when things may not go quite so well. Sorry to end on a down note here. But certainly rent seeking will always be an issue. With the existence of a state that has the power to essentially redistribute resources in some form, whether through taxes or rights granted or whatever it is, it means that there's a benefit to expend resources to try and get these beneficial things from the state. So rent seeking will always be an issue. You might recognize this idea even if you hadn't heard the term, but if you take the idea of the market and capitalism and you put it within the context of democracy, you could see where you would get a political entrepreneur. These would be political actors or politicians that are focused on essentially selling the power of the state for their own power. So they are running on a platform that gives policies that they think will help them get reelected, that may not actually be the best for the country, but they appeal to people because they deliver immediate results without much sacrifice. And so I think you might start to see some of the criticisms we hear in this country's politics. And then there's the problem that people actually have from a pure economic point of view. It makes sense actually in the political sphere to be apathetic, or as it says here, rational ignorance. So if you use the Homo economicus way of thinking, voting does not make sense. You have to expend quite a bit of effort to learn enough, particularly once you move down the ballot on elections, to learn enough about who to vote. And your one vote, it is hard to say, necessarily changes an election. So you've got to be wanting to do the voting not because of self-interest, but because of something in maybe the community realm, that sense of civic duty. That's got to be the thing motivating you. And so if it's that market thinking, then we could see that could be problematic for the future of democracy. All right. Made it through another chapter. We've got 2 more realms to go, and then you've got a really good understanding of the economic systems that we'll then in the future take to actually apply to the various countries around the world.